Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pasadena Conservatory of Music. We are delighted to be putting on the second year of music talks. This is a two-part series that we put together as an expression of thanks for your very generous support of our school. Last year we had Dr. Viskontas with us, and she did such an amazing job that we said, please come back, and so she's back with us. And you'll see her soon, but I'm instructed to remind you there is a reception afterwards in the courtyard, so if you didn't get a chance to have a drink, you will get a chance. And you will also all receive the book that she has recently written. So we look forward to giving that to you at the end. So please welcome Dr. Indre Viskontas.
Good evening, and thank you so much for being here. And thank you to the Pasadena Conservatory of Music for having me back, especially now that I'm peddling a book. So particularly nice, which is a very odd place to be. So I wrote this book because for a long time I felt like trying to distill music using science took away some of its magic. And I should really have known better because I'm a scientist at heart as well as a musician, and science has only ever made things more interesting. But I started to wonder what if I turned this whole question around and asked, what can music tell us about the science that I love and am most familiar about, psychology? What can music tell us about ourselves? And that's really the approach I took for this book. And I was fortunate enough to have a publisher in Chronicle Books. They're a San Francisco-based publishing house, and they're very interested in the visual side of their book. So you'll see the book is robin's egg blue, just in time for Easter. It puts in an Easter basket, it's small, in case you need more selling points. So they wanted to really sort of highlight the joy of music and what it can tell us about ourselves. And so that's what I'd like to do tonight, is to give you a little bit of information, but also to kind of look at music as a lens through which we can see ourselves and get to know ourselves a little bit better, as opposed to dissecting music itself. So, those of you who have children at the Pasadena Conservatory or anywhere else are probably dying to know, and I will tell you, we'll tackle this topic first, will music get them to Harvard? This is the Mozart effect. You see these kinds of claims all the time. Listening to Mozart makes your child smarter. It helps in mental development. Is that true? And if it is, how is that possible? So I will first say that we need to look at what people mean when they say Mozart effect. And the first thing that we know about the brain, and that goes across all disciplines of psychology, is the fact that our brains are really good at recognizing patterns. That's something that we seem to be optimized for. We will see patterns in things even when they don't exist. So here you have random prime numbers. I don't know if you've noticed that already. But some of you are probably already looking to see what is it that brings these numbers together in this way. That's one of the reasons why we are attracted to music. Music is about pattern recognition, and the patterns that we hear in music are really meaningful to us because they tell us something that language cannot, usually about ourselves. We are able to connect with each other emotionally in a way that language falls short, and that's because we can recognize these patterns of emotion in music. So that means that when people first heard about the Mozart effect, they thought it must be because somehow it drives this pattern recognition system in the brain. It kind of makes you better at math and vocabulary and so forth. And the initial effect was coined from a very short little paper written in 1993. This is essentially almost the entire paper, from the University of California in Irvine. And what they did is they asked their undergraduate students to perform a series of subtests of the IQ, Stanford Binet IQ tests. And they had three conditions. In one condition, the students were played a little bit of a Mozart piano sonata. In another condition, they were listening to relaxation tapes. And in a third condition, there was just nothing, silence. And it turns out that if they listened to music, they performed better on the IQ tests. That's essentially what that figure shows you. They performed better on the IQ test. So this is where they said, well, Mozart must make you smarter because it boosts your IQ performance. Well, this effect lasted for 15 minutes. So it makes you smarter for 15 minutes, but so does eating a chocolate bar. So apparently does reading a Stephen King chapter. Really, this is about arousal. It's a lot less boring to sit and listen in silence or relaxation tapes if you're listening to Mozart, and that boosts your arousal such that you're actually slightly more awake to perform those IQ tests. So that's actually the Mozart effect. Not that exciting, not exactly what we were hoping when we put, Mozart on, for pregnant women's bellies, right? Thinking that this was going to somehow change fetal development. So then the question was, well, okay, but we know that, musicians, like we think we're smart. Can't we just prove that somehow? Come on, right? So there was a study that a group did in Toronto where they looked at essentially kids who were taking music lessons, and they wondered whether those kids had higher IQs. And so here's the paper, and these were 144 6-year-olds, and they were divided up, or they were in 4 different groups. They had Kodali music lessons, either voice or keyboard. They had drama classes, so there was at least some other classes they might have had, or they had no lessons. And then once again, they were subjected to these IQ tests. And what the researchers found was that the kids who had music lessons, regardless of whether it was keyboard or voice, tend to perform higher on these IQ tests than the kids who took drama or no lessons. Now, I will say to the drama kids, they actually scored higher on empathy, which is interesting. So this effect was then, taken to say, well, okay, it's not just listening to music. You have to be making music to get the Mozart effect, to get this enhancement in IQ. And that ultimately has been proven true. But the problem with this original study and with studies like this is that there is a socioeconomic status difference between these kids because they are not randomly assigned. And if you can afford to give your kids piano lessons or voice lessons, in general, you are probably better off with someone who can't afford those kinds of extracurricular activities for their kids. So then another group of researchers in Boston took a group of public students who did not have access to a music program, who were matched for socioeconomic status and parent education, and then did this longitudinal study. They actually gave them instrumental music lessons. So they had, the ones who were in the treatment group had an hour of instrumental lessons every week. And the others had a group music lesson, but it wasn't that kind of intensive instrumental music teaching. And then they looked at how their brains changed after just over a year of these lessons. And here they found measurable differences in the brains of the students who had the music lessons compared with students who didn't have the individualized lessons. And these brain changes were in areas that are kind of where we would expect to see changes. So in the auditory cortex, the part of the brain that is involved in processing sound. In the motor area related to hand coordination and voluntary hand movement. And in the corpus callosum, which is the fiber tract that joins the 2 hemispheres. So one of the things that instrumentalists learn is how to coordinate the 2 sides of their bodies. And so we actually see these measurable changes in the part of the brain that joins the hemispheres. But, and they showed, better performance on tests that were similar to the ones that they had been, that like melody discrimination, rhythm discrimination, etc. But they did not show changes in IQ in some of these, what we call far transfer skills. So skills that are less like the immediate skills that are being trained up in instrumental music. But eventually, some researchers did find that practicing a musical instrument in childhood can enhance verbal ability and nonverbal reasoning. So these are what we call far transfer skills. But the catch is that you have to take at least 3 years of instrumental music training in order to show this effect. And those who did have 3 years of instrumental music training showed better performance on outcomes closely related to music and on outcomes distantly related to music. And how well they performed these outcomes was predicted by the duration of training. So we can say that's a kind of dose-response effect. The more music education you get, the better you are. So there you have it. What's going on here in this conservatory is really beneficial, is really important, even in skills that are quite far from actually playing that instrument. One of the things that music seems to be able to do is to teach us how to communicate with each other, obviously, not just using language. And that is true even in infancy. So there's a lovely study of kids, babies, who at 6 months were exposed to participatory music making. And participatory is important. If the infants were just passive, they actually did not show the benefit. But after 6 months of this group music making, the babies that were in the participatory condition were better able to communicate with others and better able to understand gestures. So here's a very communicative baby. Probably has lots of music lessons under his belt. So there's this side of it, that music is social, and the reason that I highlight the social side of it beyond just the IQ is because in some ways this has an even bigger potential effect on our society. Because of the social aspect of music, kids who have music programs in their schools are more likely to go to school. It improves attendance, especially in areas where attendance is an issue. Kids who suffer the most from music program cuts are the ones who need music programs the most, because that's where the music programs have the biggest effect. They get the kids to come to school and to stay in school, and if the kids stay in school, they're less likely to be on the streets and engaging in activity that eventually could land them in jail. In fact, if you take the amount of money that society has to pay for one child who gets lost in the system and ends up in jail, and instead take that child and put them into a music program like the one run here by your Gustavo Dudamel at the LA Phil, and induce them to come to school, one student who does not end up in jail pays for 10 years of a music teacher's salary. So this is something that economically makes sense. What does not make sense is cutting music programs in the places where there is the least amount of funding for public education. So to demonstrate the Mozart effect in action, I'd like to invite one of the students here at the Pasadena Conservatory, Phillip, to play some, not Mozart, but Bach cello suites. So you didn't just recognize patterns in the sound. You also learned a little bit about Phillip. You learned how he feels, how he expresses his feelings, maybe some of the things that he struggled with and how he experiences joy. And all of these things might not even be conscious to you or explicit, but there's something that you feel. And you probably feel a little bit closer to him now than you did before. And this is one of the magical things about music that I want to talk about next. And that is, how does music serve as medicine? Music just makes us feel better. Here's a great example of how a lot of us use music to help us do something that is hard, like exercising. Because it makes us feel like this, right? This is much more fun to exercise in this state than it is if you're really struggling. And one of the reasons that it makes us feel great is because we don't just hear music, we don't just see the notes, we don't just see the rhythm, we feel the beat. Even babies, even kittens feel the beat. In fact, the way that we process rhythm in our brains is very much tied to our motor activity. It's very much in the parts of our brain that are involved in generating voluntary motor movements. That's why people who suffer from Parkinson's disease, for example, which is a disease in which the ability to move voluntarily is affected, can actually benefit from music in pretty specific ways. So in Parkinson's disease, the slice of brain on the left here, you'll see, doesn't have as much of that black substance as it does on the right. That black substance is a brain region called substantia nigra, so it's named because it looks black. And it's the part of the brain in which cells create a neurotransmitter or produce a neurotransmitter called dopamine. You've probably heard about dopamine. People think about it as the reward chemical, but it's also a chemical that is involved in helping us initiate voluntary movement. So in patients with Parkinson's disease, what happens is that cells in this area die. So these patients have a much harder time producing dopamine. And in fact, it's when the symptoms of Parkinson's start showing up, 80% of these cells are gone. So it's really pretty hard to reverse, in fact impossible at the moment, to reverse that problem. Probably only eventually when we are able to implant new cells in this region that can take on the function of those cells, we'll be able to cure Parkinson's disease. Now we have treatments that involve giving them a drug precursor to dopamine, which crosses the blood-brain barrier and then boosts their dopamine for a little while, but it doesn't last forever. Eventually the brain develops a tolerance and the drug is no longer effective. This is what the brain of a person with Parkinson's disease on the right looks like compared to a 70-year-old counterpart in terms of how much dopamine there is in this region and across the brain. And so these patients really suffer from low dopamine. Well, one way to naturally boost dopamine levels is to listen to music. Music actually boosts dopamine levels in the brain. But there's another reason why it's effective in Parkinson's disease in particular. A person with Parkinson's disease has trouble, as I mentioned, initiating movement. Getting up out of a chair is really hard. Walking is really hard. They take what we call these kind of Parkinsonian shuffle steps, where it's labored and it's intensive, and they're short, and just walking across the room is a real struggle. And that's why people with Parkinson's disease, can feel very depressed ultimately, because all of a sudden something that they took for granted that was easy, their body betrays them. They can no longer do it. But the nice thing is that one of the things that music can do is entrain the person to a beat, and then they can use that beat to help them move. And in fact, we see the parts of the brain that are involved in this kind of activity in music are the parts that need help in people with Parkinson's disease. So I want to play you a short video of an intervention in the University of Calgary, where the doctors have found a way to use music to not only help people with that motor entrainment, to get them to use the beat to move, but also to use it as a reward.
At first glance, you would think these are patrons briskly walking into a state-of-the-art concert hall, excited to get the best seat in the house. They are excited, but this state-of-the-art facility is the University of Calgary. And these briskly walking patrons all have Parkinson's disease. It's not Dean Martin they have VIP passes to see, it's Dr. Ben Hu at the U of C's Experimental Neuroscience Unit. Dr. Hu is taking brisk strides into the forefront of Parkinson's research, and he's using music to do it. His study focuses on the brain's ability to bypass the damaged areas and initiate movement with the aid of music.
So I had this idea about using the music as a reward and use your walking as the behavior and combine both to establish a positive feedback. When the iPod Touch 4 came out, that dream device came true. So I designed this app called Day Reminder, in which it sends each step when we walk outside and use that signal to trigger music play. If your steps is smaller than the threshold I set up, the music stops. So here you can see the patient wearing the iPod, and he starts walking, there's no music now, and now he starts walking with larger steps, and music coming directly from his iPod. And sometimes music shuts off because the step is a little too small. So patients have to walk larger steps in order to keep music play.
I heard some exciting research that was going on at the university through Dr. Ben Hu, and the preliminary studies were showing great promise for people that walked along with some of their favorite music. Before I started this study, I had to get up an escalator, I would freeze and I couldn't step on it because I think of the movement that was downward and with the yellow lights. However, now I'm able to get onto the escalator with some reserve, but I can manage the escalator on my own.
Pretty amazing, right? You're using motivation because music, we want to keep hearing it. So if you don't, if your gait gets shorter, the music stops, so you're motivated to get it to go. But also, music is hitting up all of these areas of the brain that are damaged in people with Parkinson's disease, that aren't functioning properly. So it's a great way of showing how music can aid people with this devastating disease. Another way in which music can help is for people who have lost the ability to produce speech. So you might have heard that music can continue to be available to people who can no longer speak. And one way of harnessing the power of music to help bring speech back to people is called melodic intonation therapy. It's a type of music therapy in which the therapist essentially teaches the patient to sing what they have to say when they can't say it. So for example, a patient might have trouble with a word like I, or a sentence like I love you. But they might be able to learn to sing it over time. As with the music therapist, they sing, I love you. They do that over and over, and all of a sudden the patient can do that. And now they can access those words by essentially using the part of their brain that now has been rewired, usually on the right side, because the damage that they incurred is on the left side where the language areas are. They can use now the right side to bypass their brain damage and use their speech again. And there's a dramatic video of this that I want to share with you of someone that you probably all know, Gabby Giffords, who was a congresswoman who was shot in the head in Arizona, and the bullet hit her left frontal lobe and basically completely robbed her of speech. And this is a tragedy on many fronts, but for her in particular, because she was known as a great orator. Her ability to speak was one of the things that she was most proud of. And so to take that away from her was really devastating. So I'm going to show you a section of a video where she essentially cannot say the word light. She struggles, she tries to say the word light, she can't say it. And then all of a sudden, she's able to sing it.
The scientists and doctors learn from the patients.
Can you try and tell her? I love you.
1 month after the shooting, Gabby Giffords was in the hospital in Houston, settling in for the long haul. I can tell you that rebuilding speech after an injury to the left side of the brain is exhausting, often agonizing work. Before the shooting, she was a dynamic, engaging speaker.
We're libertarians and vegetarians. I
A Fulbright scholar, fluent in Spanish.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias.
Now, in those early therapy sessions in Houston,
You turn on the...
it seemed as though words had abandoned her.
Let's try this one. Watch me. Just turn on the...
For those of us injured on the left side of the brain, our loss of words can make us feel trapped inside our own minds.
Guys, are you frustrated? Can I tell you something? It is going to get better. Okay? It's frustrating right now, but it is going to get better. You've come a long way in 5 years. You've come a long way.
And then, in this emotionally charged moment, to our absolute amazement, we heard this.
Okay? You're going to do this. You ready? This little light of mine, I'll never shine.
Remember, at this point, she couldn't say the word light. Suddenly, there she was, singing that word and a whole lot more.
Pretty amazing. She's not singing it in tune, she's not singing it well. You can barely discern the melody in it, but it is represented in her brain, that same motor pattern she's now able to produce that she wasn't able to with speech. So one of the reasons music can be so powerful in healing the brain is because it has all these different pathways that get laid down when we learn music, when we engage with music. And so one of these pathways can be retained, even in the face of severe damage. Another example of this is a person named Clive Waring, who was an organist, or is an organist, I should say, he's still alive, in England. And he had a herpes encephalitis, a viral infection of his brain that specifically targeted or destroyed his hippocampus on both sides of the brain. This is a part of the brain that lays down new long-term memories. So you could say that he has the world's shortest memory. He can only be be aware of what has just happened a few seconds ago, 30 seconds ago, sometimes even less, he no longer remembers. And what's interesting about Clive Waring is not just that he has retained his ability to play music. He was a conductor, he was a real expert in music, but he also shows us how important memories are in terms of our own conscious minds. So he considers himself having just woken up at every moment. So he's sometimes a little bit hard to understand because he has a pretty thick accent. But often he says things like, I've never played music before. This is the first time I'm playing music. I've never seen you before. I've never felt anything before. I've never heard anything before. I've just woken up. I've been asleep, this entire time. And that's how he feels at all moments of the day. In fact, if you look at his diary, it is a series of these statements. I am now alive. Now I'm finally conscious. And all the previous ones have been crossed out because he has no memory of that. And so in his own brain, he's sort of stuck in this very limited present. That must be a really difficult way to live. And one of the ways in which music can help is that music bends time. It makes time go by quicker, and it makes time slow down to a standstill. And when Clive is engaged in music, he is able to continue to maintain consciousness for a much longer period of time. And he is able to sort of, have a kind of a more rewarding moment in his life than when he is not playing music and when his consciousness is limited to just a few seconds.
Clive Waring has one of the worst cases of amnesia in the world.
I know it's like we did now. Dead, I say, right? No difference between dreams and no sense at all. The brain has been totally inactive. No dreams and no thoughts of any kind whatever.
Clive was a renowned conductor living in London when he was struck down by a virus in 1985. Parts of his brain were completely destroyed, including his memory. However, his ability to play music is unaffected.
Do you feel different when you play music?
I've never heard a note since I've been there. I don't know what it's like to play music. They're unconscious.
You played us some music about 2 minutes ago.
Not known to me. Totally unknown. I've never heard of poetry.
Clive's case became known to millions when a television documentary was made about him in 1986. Alone and confused in hospital, without his memory, the only person he recognised was his wife, Deborah.
What's been wrong? Can you just tell me the honest with me? No way can I get to this.
But
I'm actually conscious now for the first time. I just want to find out what the hell they've been doing, what's been wrong with me. Because I have no fucking clue.
Well, this
Never seen
is-
anyone.
20 years later, Clive only has a 7-second memory before his mind goes blank. What has life been like for Clive and his family?
And yet he can play an entire piece of music from start to finish. For many minutes, he can still conduct a choir. So for those moments when he is engaged in music, his consciousness can extend throughout that time. The problem is he doesn't remember it. What about cases of people who do remember music but don't remember other things? So this brings us to Alzheimer's disease. And you might have seen the documentary film Alive Inside, which documents the fact that people with Alzheimer's disease can come alive when they are played music. Why is it that musical memory is preserved in the face of a disease that robs a person of all of their memories, including of the people they love most? And one of the reasons, just sort of very technically but not very satisfactorily, is because the part of the brain in which we see activation when a person listens to familiar music, here in the very top of the slide, the little red area, that part of the brain is preserved in the disease. So the rest of the slide shows you different ways of measuring the way that Alzheimer's disease ravages the brain. And each of those different ways of measuring it, whether it's atrophy, so cell death, or not enough activation, or the amount of the toxic protein beta amyloid, all of those measures spare, to a certain extent, that part of the brain that in which musical memory seems to reside. But it's more than just musical memory. When a person with Alzheimer's disease experiences music, There is a sense of connection, once again, that they feel with those around them, which is not possible in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease using language or other means. Being socially isolated is one of the worst things that we can do to another human being. It essentially, is a death sentence, and it's really horrible because our brains have evolved in part to help us interact with each other. So a large portion of our lives is devoted to navigating social relationships. And in fact, if you are ostracized, the parts of your brain that are involved in feeling physical pain look the same as if you were actually being in physical pain. So a person with Alzheimer's disease probably feels some of this pain, even though they don't have the sense of consciousness that we might, that because they've lost their ability to communicate using language. But music can ease that pain, and it can make them feel connected, and it can bring the caregiver, the people who love that person, a few more moments back with their original loved one, and it can be very powerful.
We first see Henry inert, maybe depressed, unresponsive, and almost unalive.
Henry.
Yeah?
Henry.
Yes,
I found your music. You want your music now? Okay. Let's try your music, okay? And then you tell me if it's too loud or not.
Then he is given an iPod containing his favorite music. And immediately he lights up. His face assumes expression, his eyes open wide. He starts to sing and to rock and to move his arms, and he's being animated by the music.
And he used to always sit on the unit with his head like this. He didn't really talk to much people. And then when I introduced the music to him, this is his reaction ever since.
So remarkable. And we sort of feel his joy. We feel that, we can see that he's enjoying himself. Which is not the case in almost any other situation in which he is presented. So it's now my pleasure to bring on stage a string quartet and a pianist to perform for you Ernest Chausson's Chanson Perpétuelle. I chose this piece because it hits themes that all of us relate to, essentially being abandoned by someone that we love. And it's in a different language. So even if you don't understand French at all, there is emotion in the music that you will understand and that you will hopefully feel in a way that will help you see how music is such a powerful social glue. But in case you don't speak French, or in case my diction is not quite up to par, I thought I'd just speak the poem for you once and then bring the other musicians. Shivering woods, starry sky, my lover has gone away, taking with him my desolate heart. Winds, won't your plaintive murmurings, nightingales, won't your charming songs go and tell him that I'm dying? The first time I saw him, my soul was his. I forgot my pride. My eyes gave me away. He took me in his nervous arms and kissed my forehead. I shivered, and then, I don't know how, he became my lover. I told him, "You'll love me as long as you can." I only ever slept well in his arms. But feeling his heart grow cold, he went away the other day to a faraway place without me. Because I no longer have my love, I will die in this pool, amid the flowers, under the sleeping current. When I reach the bank, I will say his name to the wind and wait for him to return, and I will abandon myself to the wind. My past joys will shimmer across my brow, and the green weeds will entangle me, and I will submit to their caressing grip, embracing the absence. about you, but I feel closer now. There's something about that music that allows me to express things that I couldn't while reading the poem, because there's just all this nonverbal communication that happens, and there's all of this other emotion that the other players express. Even if you didn't know what the piece was about, when Nic played those first opening lines, you would know something. You would know quite a bit about what the mood was, what the composer was feeling when he wrote this piece. And that's the social bonding aspect of music. In fact, it's probably the strongest aspect of music, and it is also tied to our neurochemistry. But first I want to show you a picture of a baby. That's pretty awesome. If you bounce babies in sync to music, the babies will feel more attached to the caregivers, even well before they can speak. In fact, if you then drop a toy, the baby is more likely to help you pick it up if you were bouncing in sync with the baby than if you were bouncing out of sync with the baby. The baby will become helpful. Imagine, even toddlers, helpful after listening to music as opposed to just me, me, me. That's in part due to this lovely hormone called oxytocin, which has been called the love hormone, but it does more than that. It's really about attachment, about social bonding, for better or for worse, in fact, because oxytocin also increases our level of aggression to people that we deem threatening to our in-group. So oxytocin is one of the reasons why we might have East Coast, West Coast hip-hop rivalries that lead to fatal violence. Because music helps us bond within a group, and then people that are considered outside of that group, it can induce rage-like behaviors. But oxytocin is one of the reasons that we seem to be in sync when we move together. That's true even in adults. So there was a study in which they had people either moving in sync with one another and the experimenter, or moving out of sync. And then the experimenter, on the way to the elevator, dropped a bunch of pencils. And those people who had moved in sync, like the babies, were more likely to help the experimenter pick up the pencils than the group that was moving out of sync. So already that's a way of kind of developing an attachment to another person. We see this entrainment to the beat even in the brainwaves, whether you're a musician or a non-musician. Even in a non-musician, we see it. So we can see the brainwaves cycle in a way that matches the beat of the music that they're listening to. Not as well in the non-musicians, but it's still there. And in fact, even when we listen to music that we know is composed by a human being, or I should say that we think is composed by a human being, the parts of our brain that are involved in theory of mind, in understanding that someone else has beliefs and intentions that might be like ours, are activated. This is a study in which they played people pieces, and they were either told this was a computer-generated piece or a human-composed piece. And the same piece generated very different brain activity, very different listening for intention, as opposed to just patterns, when the people thought that it was composed by a human being. So music can help us become better people in society by bonding us, but it can also serve to further divide us. So in that sense, it has a lot of power. I want to end tonight by showing you one more video of a music therapist that I really admire. And she works with kids who have special needs. And in particular, this video shows, once again, like patients with Parkinson's disease, that music can help motivate people to do something hard. So what's hard for a child? I know I have a 5-year-old. What's really hard? Apologizing. It seems like it's the hardest thing in the world. And I don't understand. It's all kinds of things. Look, if you'll get the toy back if you just say sorry, but nope, they refuse. It's really hard to apologize. It makes them feel bad because they're already feeling bad, and it sort of, but they have to learn to regulate those emotions. They have to learn to be social creatures if they're going to, have a rich life in society. So kids with special needs especially, have trouble with these kinds of concepts. And so music is one way in which you can actually teach kids, whether they have Down syndrome or autism, how to interact socially in ways that are more pro-social. So just to set up this video, the little girl, her name is Sammy, she was in music class, and she said some bad words. And so now the music therapist, her teacher, is teaching her how to apologize. And what I'd like you to notice, I almost don't even need to say it, but towards the end of the video, you'll see that the social bonding is also at work.
No? Okay. Sam, what is this song about?
About sing a song.
Why? Because... Yeah, we have words and music today. Here we go. I'm
Sorry
for calling you.
names.
I'm sorry.
That call you stupid.
And I don't like
That you
and no and shut
shut
up.
up.
It's not nice to say those things.
Thing.
It hurts people's feelings. Let's hear it from the beginning. I'm
Sorry
for calling you bad names, like stupid, and I don't like you. No and shut up. It's not nice to say those things. It hurts people's feelings. I won't say it again, 'cause I like you,
Cause I like you.
and I like you.
I like you.
I love doing music.
Love doing music.
You're the cutest girl ever.
Thank you.
You're the Bacik. I'm
Sorry.
I'm
Sorry.
for calling you.
Bad That was good.
So I can't say more than that. Thank you.